Hello, welcome to the CSS section of the whole course. Now, what is CSS? CSS is the stylesheet language that helps to describe the look and format of a document written in HTML. Now, for me, it just means that CSS determines the design of your website, how it looks like, a bit about how it works, but mostly on how it will appear to the visitors. This is the basic outline of CSS that we will learn. First, we look at how to use CSS, then the CSS selectors, before moving on to priority and CSS chaining. Lastly, we will try some practical real case scenario, once again with our WordPress blog. Now, let us look at some ways that we can use CSS. There are three main ways that a user can use CSS in their website. They can either load it as an external file, use it as an inline CSS, or use it as an inline style. Loading it as an external file. This is what it looks like when you load the CSS style sheet as an external file. This is what you will write to load the CSS file as an external file in your HTML document. Let's look at a real-life example on our WordPress blog. If you remember, this is the personal blog that we have built in the earlier parts of the course. In the area highlighted in green, there are several sentences of code written to load CSS as an external file. As shown here, it is possible to have multiple CSS style sheets for a HTML document. One thing you might want to note here is that if there are two exact CSS selectors in different style sheets, the one in the latest style sheet, as measured from top to bottom, will have the highest priority. Let's move on to inline CSS. In terms of concept, inline CSS works the same as CSS in an external file. The only difference is that instead of loading from a separate file, the CSS codes are written directly in the HTML document itself. To identify the usage of inline CSS, the style tag is used. The last way of using CSS is by inline style. One difference of inline style from the first two is that the CSS style coding is located right in the element. In this way, no CSS selectors will be needed. As the style only applies to the element it is located in, it is the least desirable way to use CSS styles. Shown here is an example of inline style used to make the text red in color. It's time to look at CSS selectors. Now, what is a CSS selector? Basically, a CSS selector helps to tell where in the HTML document should the design codes be applied to. Let me go through the selectors here to have a better grasp of this concept. As an example, the first line here has a P selector with the design code of margin top 5 pixel. With this single line of code, the HTML document knows that all P, which is the paragraph element, should have a margin towards their top of 5 pixel. I hope this has helped to make you understand the selector concept better. Let's go through a few more examples. For the second line of CSS code shown here, all elements in the HTML document with the class of class name will be green in color. For the last selector, the first element in the HTML document with the ID of ID name will have a font size of 20 pixels. Let's proceed to look at each element selector. The first one I will be discussing is the element ID. The ID of an element should be unique. This means that throughout the whole HTML document, only one element should have a particular ID. If there are two elements with the same ID, the CSS will only select and apply to the first one. One important reason to use ID over class is that it is faster to select an element with ID. Using ID also helps the HTML codes to perform faster, especially if you're using jQuery. Okay, element class. Element class works quite similar to element ID. Some distinct features of class as compared to ID are shown here. For class, there can be multiple elements with the same class, unlike an ID, and while each element can only have one ID, they can have several classes. What is interesting is that the design codes for a particular class will take effect on all elements with that particular class unless overridden. In this way, it helps to massively reduce lines of design codes needed in the CSS style sheet. Some of you might be wondering, what if an element has an ID and a class with different design codes? Let's say we have a scenario here. On top is the element in the HTML document, and below is the CSS coding that you find in the CSS document, also known as the style sheet. What happens here? Can you guess? Okay, let me give you the answer right now. The color of the text 5 star will be green in color. This is a simple example of CSS priority. We have here a very simple priority list. The ID selector will have the highest priority, followed by class and then element. If you have different design codes with different selectors on the same element, the design codes for ID will override the rest. CSS chaining. CSS chaining is a very simple concept, but it will be quite hard to explain. Basically, you can target more specific elements by using CSS chaining. Let's dive straight into the first example. For the first example, this selector is selecting an A element, which is the link element, that has a parent element of class icon somewhere along the hierarchy, which in turn has a parent element with class header somewhere along the hierarchy. Here is an example of the HTML coding. The link Google shown in this example below will be selected by the CSS selector above and become gray in color. If you notice, although the selector didn't specify the class of wire, it's okay. As long as the order of parent selector is correct, the link here will be selected and turned into gray color. With chaining of CSS, we need to look at the priority of CSS chaining as well. In this case, we will be using the same example, but with another selector that is more specific, as it also specifies the class wire. Here, the color of the Google link will be red instead of gray. This means that a more specific selector will be given priority. In the last section of this video, we will look at special CSS selectors. By putting a double colon and the text hover behind a selector, anytime the user hovers over the element selected by this selector, the design code on the right will take effect. In the first example here, the A link will be blue in color when the user hovers over it. Using an angled close bracket in selector, it means that the element after the bracket is nested directly within the element before it. Let's look at an example here. The li element will only be bold if it is directly nested in the ul element with no other parent elements between them. There are many other special selectors that are less frequently used. If you need them, you can easily find them online or look at my attached document. I think we have covered many important concepts that you need about CSS in this video. Feel free to update me if I miss anything crucial. If I find anything important that I have missed, I will add more videos along the way in this section. Thank you for watching this video. I will see you in the next video where we look at how we can apply what we have just learned here.